Hello again, and welcome back to my channel where I'm discussing the Bible texts in light of putting aside presuppositions that we've been taught for years by uh, many churches and looking at the Bible fresh from an academic point of view rather than what we've been teachings and ideas that we've been handed down through the generations. So today I want to do something slightly different. And I'm going to review an essay that I wrote last term in my university course, where we had to analyse a particular passage of scripture. So I chose John chapter 8 and verse 58. And now this is going to be a sort of third and follow-up video to two that I previously have done. If you look at my website, The Faithful Departed, here we are, and there's two videos I did previously. One here, are John 8:58 and Exodus 3:14 connected grammatically? And the other one is I and He, the secret liturgical name of God. So what I would do is I would suggest having a look at those two videos either first before watching the rest of this video, or after you've watched this video, you can go back and look at those two videos and they will fill in a lot of information that I'm maybe just going to allude to and skirt over in this particular video. But so this is going to be the third video in this mini series, which is quite ironic as it's a study to show that the Trinity is not actually stated in these verses. It's not John 8:58 is not a Trinitarian proof text, so it's quite ironic that I've used three videos to counter that view. So anyway, so let's begin. So let me just bring up the text we're going to look at. And okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see that on screen, just over my shoulder. So as it says there, it's an analysis of a New Testament text being John, specifically John chapter 8 and verse 58. And so I'm just going to read through this and then make some salient points throughout it. And what I'd point out first of all is as we go through the text, you'll see a lot of quotations that I've put into the text, and I've marked them all, numbered them all. So I won't specify each quotation where it's come from during this video, but I'll just scroll down this now, and you can do this obviously at your own leisure. You can stop the video and you can have a look at my footnotes here, which gives you all the cited quotations, all the references, the resources that I've referred to and taken all the quotations from. So they're all numbered there, and all good theological references. So you can have a look at that at your leisure, just to show where all the quotations have come from, and I'm not just making this all up, basically. So we'll go to the start, and I'm just going to read through it, as I say, and then I'll make some salient points as we go through it. We'll start off by saying that the thesis of this essay is that a Trinitarian exegesis of John 8:58, in which Jesus is understood to be identifying himself as Yahweh, fails to fully consider the interpretive bearing that the contextual setting and the nuance of the term ego eimi has on the discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees, in order to discern the writer's original rhetorical intention. So I'm making the point that, I've watched so many videos in the past and read so many books where Trinitarians are trying to use this passage as a proof text that Jesus is claiming to be Yahweh, Jehovah, that he is God. And I'm making the point that if you understand the context of this chapter, what's actually going on in the background, the setting of the verses, that we see information that helps us to understand the original rhetorical intention of the gospel writer. Okay, so next paragraph, it tells us that although recorded in Greek, this conversation was likely spoken in Hebrew or Aramaic, the gospel writer probably taking literary license to either embellish an actual historical discussion or to concoct a narrative for the purpose of making a, quote, theological interpretation of his, that is Jesus' person, not a transcript of his words, end of quote. So I'm making this point that what we're reading here, we're reading English translated from the Greek, the Koine Greek that the text was originally written in. But we've got to bear in mind that the event as such would have been spoken either in Hebrew or Aramaic. So we're taking passages, texts that were originally spoken in either one or two languages, translated into a third language, and then translated into English. So, and we've got to bear in mind that the gospel writer is telling us here, or using this passage, this text, as a theological interpretation of Jesus, how he understood Jesus, not necessarily a transcript of the actual words that were spoken. Okay, so before we go any further on that, I want to just make this point even further by referring to this book here, God as Spirit, written by Geoffrey Lamp. Geoffrey Lamp was Regius Professor of Divinity in the University of Cambridge, and he's one of the most highly respected English theologians of the 20th century. This is a fantastic book to read in its entirety. But when I was reading it just recently, I came across some passages that were pertinent to that paragraph I've just read to you, and I just wanted to read a few comments from this book just to back up what I was saying. Now, he says on page 102, he says, "It is a fact that although we need not think of the overall impression of Jesus, which we derive from the Synoptic Gospels, as simply misleading," he says, "we are unable to determine with complete certainty that the tradition behind any particular saying or story contained in these Gospels goes back to the historical Jesus himself." Okay, so it's a proviso we've got to be aware of, that we're reading theological works, but written by these gospel writers. And I think the academic world acknowledges the fact that none of these gospel writers were, in fact, the names that are given or ascribed to these gospels, and therefore the writers were not necessarily first-hand eyewitnesses of these events, but rather we're seeing a recording of maybe oral tradition as to these events. He goes on to say that, speaking about Jesus, he says he is rather a mythical embodiment of an ideal Son of God, a notional second Adam, in whom there is represented, in the guise of an historical character, the ideal of sonship. He is an ideal or mythical person who symbolizes the goal to which that divine activity is tending. He stands for the end towards which God's creativity is directed, the perfect integration of God's Spirit with human personality. Now, he's not saying that the man Jesus never existed. He's not saying that at all. But what he's saying is that the Jesus that we see recorded in the New Testament is not necessarily the actual historical Jesus. And the words and the sermons that that are recorded there may not be exactly what this man Jesus actually spoke, but may well be the embellishments of these writers of the oral tradition. So So just, to make that point, first of all, he goes on to say, page 104, he says, there is too a basically unchanging Christian experience of finding in the words and deeds ascribed to Jesus and in the picture of his personality which the Gospels convey, in spite of all the strangeness, a fresh understanding of God. And he says that the Christ of faith whom we encounter in the pages of the New Testament is Jesus of Nazareth, clothed in the religious imagery of the ancient scriptures, interpreted whether by himself or by others in terms of such concepts as Son of Man, Messiah, Son of God, Prophet. And he says at the bottom of page 105, it is also clear that the Jesus of the Gospels is the Christ of faith projected back into the pre-Easter period. Right? So he's saying that the understanding or the interpretation of the man Jesus post-Easter, and the views that the early Christian church took of Jesus at that point has been retrojected back onto the pre-Easter Jesus in these accounts. A couple more quotes. He says in page 106, some of the sayings material and some of its forms in the synoptic gospels must be the work of someone other than Jesus. And some of the information about his doings and some of its forms must be inauthentic. And it is much more probable that this applies to a considerable proportion of the synoptic tradition. So that's the synoptics. He then comments on the Gospel of John on page 107. He says that the fourth gospel is perhaps the greatest book in the New Testament, and I tend to agree, it's probably my favourite book of the New Testament. He says, we may think, as I do myself, that this gospel is substantially a reinterpretation of Jesus by a mind of supreme insight and most profound understanding, a Christian disciple of great genius and a master of subtle irony. The fourth gospel is the work of a mind or minds other than the mind of Jesus, for the most part at least, but inspired by the same Spirit of God that was in Jesus. This remains true even though this Jesus may represent the interaction of God's Spirit with the human spirit of John rather than the historical Jesus. And then just a final point, page 109, he says, an instance of an element which belongs to a very late stratum of the tradition, and which at the same time seems strangely out of keeping with the Sermon on the Mount, is the bitter exchanges of Jesus with the Jews in John chapter 8 and elsewhere in the fourth Gospel. These seem clearly to be retrojections into John's picture of the life of Jesus, of the disputes between church and synagogue in his own time. So again, he's making the point that this Jesus and this account that we have here in John chapter 8, this bitter exchange between Jesus and the Jews, may not be exactly the words spoken at this event, but it's really a theological interpretation of this account. And it's retrojecting into this account the picture of what was happening in the early church of the first century Jewish Christians and the dispute they were having with the nominal Jews of the synagogue. So that's really the background to this passage. And we have to bear that in mind when we're considering how we interpret this passage. So let's go back to the text, and I'll just bring the screen back up again. Okay, so we'll carry on. So this essay will show that Jesus, by his invoking the name ego eimi, was not claiming to be the I am of Exodus 3:14. It will also show that Jesus was not arguing that he had literally pre-existed Abraham, and that the Pharisees were not attempting to stone Jesus for claiming to be Yahweh. So this is going to counter the Trinitarian interpretation of this verse. It's also going to counter the view of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that this is a proof text that Jesus, the man Jesus, literally pre-existed in heaven before coming to earth, pre-existing as the Archangel Michael. That's the interpretive slant that they put on this. So the information I'm going to go through here is going to counter both these ideas. So conversely, that Jesus was identifying himself as the Messiah, God's theophanic representative, quote, i.e., the agent of salvation, the visible representative of God who bears his name, end of quote. So this is a theophanic passage. It's basically the intent of the writer is to show that in Jesus we are seeing a theophany of God. That Jesus is the agent of salvation. He's the visible representation of God, much like the angel of the burning bush was the theophanic representation visibly of God and could even speak as Yahweh, Jehovah, although being the angel of God. So that's what I intend to prove in this video. So context, most important. The context is the 7-day Festival of Tabernacles, which, quotes, acts as a mise-en scene of an ongoing identity dispute in John's chapter 7, verse 1 through to John chapter 8 and verse 59, and, quote, sets the stage for adequately disclosing the actual identity of Jesus and his mission as the embodiment of the eschatological presence of God and his saving actions. End of quote. Now, note the nuance of understanding here in this quotation. The writer is not saying that this is to prove that Jesus is God in the flesh, come down from heaven, that he is actually Yahweh, but rather, much as we were saying about the angel of the burning bush, that Jesus is the embodiment of the eschatological presence. It's the visible manifestation that God is present, that God is acting in this man and is acting in history towards the nation of Israel. It's a nuanced point that we mustn't forget. So continuing on, the festival utilized 3 symbolic ceremonies. The first was the water drawing libation, in which water was drawn from the pool of Siloam. The illumination of the temple, consisting of 4 giant menorahs. And finally, the Roshana Rabbah procession, in which the priests marched around the altar 7 times on the 7th day. The significance of the first 2 being, quote, the water libation ceremony may carry a messianic connotation, end quote. And further, quote, the later rabbis applied the thought to the Messiah. Light is the name of the Messiah, end of quote. So we see that the writer of the gospel is setting it in this Festival of Tabernacles and has Jesus referring to the water drawing libation ceremony and the illumination of the temple, because he knows that these are messianic symbols. And when Jesus is applying them to himself, saying that he is the living water and to drink of his water, and that he is the light of the world, he's basically using these as a way of signifying that he is the Messiah. Now, starting at chapter 7 and verse 37, Jesus subsumes the water libation ceremony imagery, saying, if any man is thirsty, he can come to me and drink. Then in chapter 8, verse 12, he likewise says, I am the light of the world. And in doing so, he is teaching that he embodies the eschatological reality of these symbols. Quote, in other words, the physical presence of Jesus in the sanctuary during the Festival of Tabernacles already embodies the eschatological presence of God, end of quote. Now, verses 13 to 32 tell us a debate ensues as to Jesus' identity and authority. Some say he is the prophet, some say the Christ. Others question his Galilean heritage. And despite saying twice in verses 24 and 28 that, quote, I am he, or ego eimi in the Greek, using the term ego eimi, which is a simple predicate of identification also used by the blind beggar in chapter 9, verse 9. And here's the point. None say he is claiming to be Yahweh. So they say all sorts of things. He's the prophet. He's the Christ. None of them say he's claiming to be Yahweh. In verse 33, the Pharisees assert their authorial legitimacy, stating they are Abraham's offspring. And in verse 41, they impugn Jesus' own heritage, believing him to be an illegitimate offspring of fornication. Then in verse 53, Abraham is reintroduced as an authority figure who they believe Jesus is trying to usurp. Verse 54, Jesus claims that his Father is the God they worship, and in doing so equates Yahweh with God the Father. Now, that's a really interesting verse. I'd like to read that from the New English Bible. Verse 54, Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, that glory of mine is worthless. It is the Father who glorifies me, he of whom you say he is our God. So do you get the point? They're talking about the Father, God the Father. And Jesus is saying, the Father is he who you say is your God. So he's making the point that the Jews don't worship a Trinity. They don't worship a God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. They worship one person, the Father. And that's coming from, well, what we've been told here is from Jesus' own lips. He's saying that the God of the Jews is the Father. That's who they worship. They don't worship a Trinity. In verse 56, he then refers to passages, quote, passages from the Targums, which illustrate how Jewish thought developed the figure of Abraham in connection with the theme of deliverance and salvation, end quote. Contrasting Abraham to the lack of discernment of Jesus' identity, he says Abraham rejoiced at seeing his day. And in doing so, Jesus is likely referring to the Targum Jonathan, which states in Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 12, quote, I have declared unto Abraham your father what would come to pass. And thereby Jesus utilizes the Targumist tradition that Abraham had been given a vision of the Messiah, his promised seed. Quote, therefore, Abraham had a distant vision of what Christ would bring. By faith, Abraham, not having possessed what was promised, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, end of quote. So the Jewish tradition is that Abraham was given this vision of Jesus' day, or really the fulfillment of the promise that was given to him of his seed, that the Christ, the Messiah. So Jesus had been referring to that tradition when he says, Abraham saw his day. Now, the next paragraph, Jesus' point is not that Abraham survived to that first century, to their day, but by his eyes of faith was able to discern the messianic age to come. Whereas, despite the Pharisees literally seeing Jesus and hearing his words, they failed to recognize him as the Messiah. In verse 57, they blindly misunderstand Jesus as saying that he saw Abraham. Because Jesus replies in verse 58, before there was an Abraham, I am. Now, Jesus was not confirming their misunderstanding. And his nuanced statement was not to be misunderstood in terms of linear temporality, as the Pharisees had done. Because remember, Jesus had said, Abraham saw his day. He didn't say that I saw Abraham, but that's how the Pharisees misunderstand him. They think that he saw Abraham's day. And the Trinitarians will go to chapter 18 of Genesis and say that Jesus was God the Son appearing before Abraham among the three visitors. And again, the Jehovah's Witnesses will interpret this to say that he existed literally before Abraham because he was the Archangel Michael in heaven. But Jesus was not confirming this misunderstanding. So back to the paragraph, Rudolf Bultmann explains. Now, Rudolf Bultmann is one of the most famous German theologians, highly regarded as one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. So he explains, quote, they, I mean the Pharisees, cannot understand because the notion of the revealer's pre-existence can only be understood as the eternity of the divine word of revelation. For all speculative notions of which Jesus as a pre-existent being consider the revealer in the same temporal terms as did the Jews, whereas the true meaning of pre-existence excludes any such way of thinking. Similarly, John A.T. Robinson insightfully states that the gospel writer, quote, is deliberately telling two stories, two histories at once, and superimposing them on each other. The first story is that of the personified eternal Logos, that is, God's personified wisdom, his expressed mindful thoughts. The second is of the human Messiah. Robinson further states, quote, it is absurd to say that this historical individual, Jesus, is pre-existent. To mix up the stories as the Jews do is to make nonsense of everything, end of quote. Explaining how to make sense of time as a narrative tool in John's Gospel, Douglas Estes writes, quote, John's Gospel is narrating a theological treatise by combining the quasi-historical events of Jesus' ministry combined with the story of the eternal Logos. Two stories in one narrative. It creates a whole new world of the narrator with its own parameters of space and time. There are now two narrative worlds, end of quote. So we're reading a quasi-historical account which includes the story of this Jesus, historical Jesus, with the story of the Logos, which brings us back to John chapter 1, of course, and how the Logos became Jesus, or is embodied in Jesus. So there's two characters, two events combined in one story here. So how are we to explain Jesus being before Abraham, if not literally, temporally? The answer is, as R.G. Hamilton Kelly suggests, that, quote, ideal pre-existence be used to describe entities which pre-exist in the mind or plan of God, end of quote. Also, as Frederick Kuhn says, quote, Kuschel and other scholars think of the notion of pre-existence as something which, at its core, is not connected to temporality. Talks of pre-existence might use the language of temporality, but its actual meaning concerns Jesus' significance and his belonging to the realm of God. Jesus is not a single event, but rather is himself a recurring event in time and history. Causality is, quote, a temporal notion that the after effect is locatable in the before, in the cause. End of quote. So it's basically saying that the events of Jesus and his human existence and what he achieves is in effect the after effect of an event that's locatable in the before, in the cause. So he is both the cause and the after effect. It's like a circle in time that the after effect could not be without the cause and the cause is only there as a result of the after effect. As a philosophical point, when we're studying the New Testament and Jewish thinking, so well expressed there. Therefore, the significance of Abraham in this debate is due to the promise given to him by God in Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 to 8, that through his seed, God will accomplish his intentions. So if you look at Genesis chapter 17, we will see in verse 1 where it talks about when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said that I may live always in my presence and be perfect, so that I may set my covenant between myself and you and multiply your descendants. And Abraham threw himself to the ground. God says, I make this covenant, I make it with you. You shall be the father of a host of nations. Your name shall no longer be Abram, your name shall be Abraham. Okay? So back to my text. So God will accomplish his intentions significantly because of the promise given to Abraham. He is immediately renamed as Abraham. Therefore, just as we've read from chapter 17, the idea and promise of the seed precedes and causes the beginning of Abraham. Now, Jesus recognized himself to be that promised seed, i.e. the Messiah. Galatians 3:16 tells us that, and thus could rightly say, before there was an Abraham, I am. Therefore, Abraham only existed as a consequence of Jesus having pre-existed ideally in God's mindful intentions. Jesus effectively being the causative principle of Abraham becoming Abraham. So before there was an Abraham, before there was a promise made to Abram, the promise had to be made first. And Jesus was the outcome of that promise. So if Jesus is the outcome of that promise, then he effectively is that promise. He is the cause of Abraham becoming Abraham. Therefore, before Abraham, I am. You see, the Messiah predated Abraham because the Messiah was the causal promise that meant that Abraham became Abraham. And finally, regarding the third tabernacle ceremony, the Rosh Rabbah procession, based on Deuteronomy chapter 32:39, quote, in which the daily invocation by priests during the Festival of Tabernacle includes the obscure expression Ani Wahu, literally I and he. This formula is a mutation of the hidden name of God, the Shem Hamaforesh. End of quote. So, and this is my view on this, and I have to say it's based on this Gospel according to John, written by Raymond Brown in the Anchor Bible series. There's an appendix on it, in which he also alludes to C.H. Dodd's work, The Interpretation of the Fourth Gospel. So this is where I've got this from, not just plucked it out of the air. It's based on these well-respected theological books. So Jesus' use in verse 58 of the phrase ego eimi, or more probably the priestly ani wahu, was a double entendre or play on words signifying that he and the Father are the I and he, the two witnesses to his authority, and that, quote, these words point to Jesus as the authorized envoy, end of quote, who speaks on the Father's behalf. So not pointing to Jesus as Yahweh, but pointing to Jesus as the authorized envoy, the Messiah, the Christ. By appropriating to himself the prerogative of the priests and using the Shem Hamaforash, he inferred that he is the mediatorial channel of God's salvation to Israel. The very act of pronouncing the divine name, or this quasi double entendre liturgical name for God within the temple courtyards, was a theophanic event, an example of name theology, signifying in Jesus we behold God's salvific presence. But to the unbelieving Pharisees, it was blasphemy and grounds for stoning. So the point I'm making is that the priests during the Festival of Tabernacles would march around the altar each day for 7 days, and on the seventh days they would march around 7 times. And as they were doing so, they would recite the liturgical name Ani Wahu. So it's like a substitute, a mutation of the Anihu from the books of Isaiah, passage in Isaiah, where God says, I am He. So they use this mutated version of it, but it stands for the divine name, the Shem HaMephoresh. And this was the only time that the priests were allowed to use this, much like the high priest was the only one going into the most holy on Yom Kippur would be allowed to actually use the proper expression of the tetragrammaton. Only the high priest could do that. The other priests on this tabernacles event could use the mutated name Aniwahu. So what we have here is Jesus is using the Aniwahu expression that the priests were only allowed to use. Only they could use it. Because using the divine name, and this is why if you use the divine name, you could be stoned. It's because using the divine name, and certainly doing so within the temple, was a means of theophany. It was like calling God's presence into being within the temple. So only the priests could use it, and only on these 2 occasions. And here was Jesus using the expression Aniwahu, which gets translated into the Greek simply as ego eimi, because that's the Greek translation of Anihu from Isaiah. So he's usurping the prerogative of the priests, and he's basically saying, I'm the priest, I'm the anointed priest, representing Yahweh at this time. He's the embodiment of God's salvific presence. So, recognizing the contextual bearing that the Festival of Tabernacles has upon the interpretation of Jesus' ego eimi in John 8:58, we can dispel the common misunderstanding that connects Jesus' I am with Yahweh's I am in Exodus 3:14. The original Hebrew of which Eche Asher Eche is translated in the Septuagint as ego eimi hoon. When repeated with the singular eche, the name is translated as hoon, not ego eimi. Thus, Jesus does not say he is the hoon, but rather his ego eimi connects instead to Isaiah's Anihu references, and more importantly to the liturgical Aniwahu of the Roshana Rabbah ceremony. Therefore, as Bultmann states, quote, we should reject the view that ego eimi means, I, Jesus, am God, i.e. that the sentence identifies Jesus with God. So Bultmann is saying we should reject this Trinitarian view that ego eimi means, I am God. Further, Jesus was not claiming to have pre-existed Abraham, literally, but was announcing that he was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, that as the Messiah, he was the causative principle for the existence of Abraham, and therefore precedes him in God's intentions. So remember that the dispute was, they were saying that Abraham, he wasn't greater than Abraham, and Jesus was saying, well, if it wasn't for me, there wouldn't be an Abraham. That's how he precedes Abraham and is greater than Abraham. Abraham wouldn't have existed if Jesus as the promised seed had not existed in the first place. So by appreciating the context of the Festival of Tabernacles, we can recognize Jesus pronouncing the priestly Ani Wahu as manifesting God's theophanic and salvific presence in the temple. The Pharisees, seeing and hearing Jesus, utilized the priestly prerogative to vocalize the Shem Hamaphoresh at the festival. They sought to stone him for this blasphemy, not because they understood him to claim to be Yahweh. So I'll just come out of share screen. So I hope that makes sense to you. Please go back and read it through again if you like. Please have a look at the footnotes so that you get all the references to the quotations that I've made. And as I say, I think that this properly explains these passages in John chapter 7 through to the end of chapter 8, where Jesus is not trying to prove that he is God the Son, that he is Yahweh, but rather the passage is written by the gospel writer to prove that in Jesus we are hearing the words of the Father. We're hearing the Logos being spoken. He was the Logos, the plan, the purpose of God in living flesh. He was the Messiah, the Christ that speaks for the Father and that who fulfills the priestly the role as the physical presence of God manifested visibly before Israel. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Please give me a like if you've enjoyed it. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. Go back and have a look at the two videos I mentioned at the start of the video, and I hope to see you the next time. So thanks for watching, and see you again. Bye-bye.